We have been, except for last week when I wasn't here, we have been trekking through the Sermon on the Mount, which is one of the most important instances of Jesus' teaching in the Bible, and it comes in Matthew chapters 5, 6, 7. And we're going to dive into that a little bit more today, but what I do have a question for you. Did anybody here have a swear jar? You did the what thing? The soap thing. Oh, yeah. Yeah. They didn't like that on A Christmas Story. That's, no. So, Lifebuoy, as long as it's not Lifebuoy soap. Well, you know, it's one of those jars that you keep in your house. Keep it on a shelf. You keep it on a table. And every time someone lets a swear word slip, you have to put $1 in the jar. It's usually an attempt to teach someone in the house to stop cussing. Maybe a kid, maybe your spouse. But for some of us, it kind of becomes a vacation fund, right? If some of our jars would be very full. You know, you can retire early or go to Disneyland or Europe every couple of months. So you better keep a lot of spare bills in your pocket. Jesus is teaching us something here about swearing today, but it's a different kind of swearing. He's talking about swearing an oath, swearing that you'll do this or that you won't do that, making these vows that we sometimes make. And he says, even though scriptures say to uphold your oaths, he says, don't even swear an oath in the first place. Don't swear an oath on heaven or on earth or on your nation or on your own head. Don't make an oath on any of these things because they don't belong to you. They belong to God. The heavens are God's throne. The earth is God's footstool. And even the very hairs of your head are not under your own control, as many of us has found out over the years. As I start to lose mine right through here, and I have a skunk stripe right there of gray. He says, just let your answer simply be yes or no. So that time I swore that I would never eat sugar again. Guess what? I guess I should have to put $1 in the swear jar, maybe. That oath did not stick. Or when I swore that I was going to start exercising. My wife shouldn't be the first one laughing. How about those New Year's resolutions? A lot of us really regret those gym memberships 2 or 3 months into the year by February or March. How many of us have broken an oath that we made to ourselves? Most of us aren't very good at keeping some of the vows we make, largely for 2 reasons. Number 1, our resolve is weak. And when we meet resistance, we often give in. We give up. Number 2, we weren't really ready to make that vow in the first place. We weren't prepared. So that first reason that we lose our resolve and give in kind of makes us feel ashamed for like being weak sometimes, right? But it's pretty darn relatable because we've all been there, right? Exercising's hard, for example, right? We all give in, especially in the beginning. You run out of breath and your muscles ache. And it takes up time out of your busy day. It's easier to just give up on a vow like that, right? Not to mention that as a society, we give up on things pretty darn easily, don't we? We live in a culture where we treat everything as disposable. It's plastic, and we just throw it away. Your dryer breaks, do you get it fixed or do you replace it? You replace it. Most of the time, these days, but it depends on what it is, you might be able to get it fixed. But not quite like in the old days. How about a tool like a hammer or an axe? If you go to Home Depot and places, you can buy like the head of an axe, for example, without the whole thing, right? And you can fix your old axe. Or your handle breaks, you can buy a new handle and you can fix your old axe. But do we do that? Do we buy a new handle and fit it to the old axe head? Or do you just go to Home Depot and buy one of those whole brand new axes with one of those fancy new shock absorbent anti-slip fiberglass handles? That's what you do. Remember those days when if your TV stopped working, you called somebody to come to your house and they fixed it? Not now. You kick it to the curb. Somebody else picks it up. Maybe they know how to fix it. I don't know. Maybe they don't. But now you just kick it to the curb and you go to Walmart and you buy a new one. I suspect that this attitude has impacted less material things in our lives too, though. We give up on more important things all too easily, like relationships. How many of us have lost friends due to disagreements about politics? Or defriended people on Faceogram, due to quotes that they have posted? Or you stop hanging out with family members because, I don't know, you don't like their taste in music or whatever silly reason. We often give up too quickly. Or you can't get along with that coworker because of some misunderstood email. Relationships and friendships are hard work. Sometimes when the going gets tough, though, we head for the hills. Thus, we even treat our friends and our relatives and our coworkers as if they are disposable. The other reason we aren't so good at oath keeping is that we often aren't ready to make vows in the first place. We're often not ready. And I'll tell you, some of you might know this, some of you might not. I have a feeling some of us that are a little bit more into ministry might have seen these kind of things. But there's this stereotype or joke or trope or whatever you want to call it about Christian youth that plays itself out on TikTok. Okay? Heard Alexis laugh. She probably knows this. The trope is that there are a lot of kids that are raised in Christian purity culture. That one where you make a promise to, let's say, not engage in any romantic behaviors until you are married. And when people wear those purity rings and all that kind of thing, well, the joke is that a lot of these kids end up going away to Bible college, and guess what happens? They fall in love at first sight. And the guys propose to the first pretty girl they see.
Ring by spring.
Ring by spring. Get a ring by spring your first year, see? It's a thing. It's a thing from somebody who went to Bible college, so, Hey, so this is a real story. This is a true story. They fall in love at first sight. The guys propose to the first girl they see, and guess what? They drop out of Bible college, or at least the girl does, which tells you something about the relationship, right? In favor of getting married. All as if this was the plan from the very beginning. Like, this is the way it works. This is what you're supposed to do to find a spouse. And people make videos on TikTok that kind of act out this drama. And they are kind of funny from an outside perspective, but probably not so funny for people who actually came from purity culture with a lot of the baggage that's attached to that. And that's a whole other sermon, so we won't talk about that right now. But, most young people at the age of 18 aren't ready to get married. Now, right? Am I right? Yes. Okay, I hope I'm right. And I'm not just saying that because I have an 18-year-old daughter in the room. Some, don't get me wrong, some are. There's some examples in this room, maybe they aren't even here today, but there are examples that come regularly to this room of people that get married very, very young, and it is what should have happened, right? It was exactly what should have happened. But those people are exceptions, right? At that age, most people aren't very mature. They're not ready. But occasionally somebody meets their soulmate at that age, and it's perfect. But generally, our brains aren't fully developed until we're in our mid-20s. We're not even done cooking our brains yet, right? So we're probably not at the best state of mind yet to make permanent decisions. It's a good reason not to go get a tattoo on your 18th birthday. We're just not ready for that kind of long-term commitment yet. But many of us did that too. Many of you attended or even participated in my ordination last year. And that was one of the biggest days of my life, and it took years of preparation before I was allowed to even enter that covenant, right? To enter that covenant with God, with the church, with myself, with my family. In fact, just to make sure I followed these vows, they gave me this. This is the ministerial code. And see all those little things that I agreed to do. You know, and it's covenant with God. I lead a life worthy of the calling to which I've been called. Demonstrate a sincere yearning for connection with the triune God, expressed in prayer, worship, Bible study, retreat, and other spiritual practices. Grow in faith, knowledge, culture, etc. Covenant with myself and with my family, to attend to my physical well-being by adopting a healthy lifestyle, including diet and exercise, and rest, setting aside time for Sabbath and vacation, accept responsibilities for all the debts that I incur. There's another contract we break often, right? Many things. Covenant with the UCC to actively participate in the covenantal life and work for all the settings. Covenant with my ministry setting, that means here, to preach and teach the gospel without fear of favor. And just on and on and on and on. Guess where this has been sitting since that day? On a shelf. Behind a bunch of knickknacks that have come from the thrift store, like kind of behind that, where I don't really see it on a daily basis. I don't really see it, but it should be reviewed regularly so that I can constantly renew my covenant and live by it and shape my life by its values. But now it sits on that shelf. And this is pretty sure the first time I've taken it out and looked at it since that day last year. So now let's look at the dreaded verses 31 and 32, which have caused a lot of pain for a lot of faithful people in the church for a very long time. These verses read, "It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." This is taken by many Christians to be a prohibition on divorce. And fair enough, because a simple reading of it really does, the simple reading, that's what it says. It's hard to get past that unless you look a little deeper, unless you dig a little deeper. But with an exception made for the case of sexual immorality, for adultery. But notice again, and we're going to keep focusing on this in the Sermon on the Mount, we have that formula that we've talked about, where Jesus says, "You've heard it said that blank, but I say to you blank." Jesus again here is trying to push us, to get us to move beyond what is simply allowed to a more holy state with more righteous actions. To learn more about what Jesus is talking about, we should look at what he's referencing, because Jesus is almost always referencing something. You have to look at it in context. And we fail to recognize that in Matthew, the author, and therefore Jesus, is virtually always referring to something in the Hebrew Scriptures. And this is no exception. We can look up this certificate of divorce in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. And here it says that a man may divorce a woman if, quote, she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. Note a few things here. Number one, it says nothing about the woman being able to divorce the man. This is very much out of cultural context, right? Although, in practice, it appears that women were able to divorce men. There are some ancient records of this. We have some of those. And especially by Jesus' time, because the Greek influence by that time had developed a slightly more egalitarian society. Although that's not saying a lot for ancient Greek society, but it was slightly better. And so there are records of women divorcing men, so it is possible. But also it says that a man can divorce a woman if he is displeased with her and finds something objectionable about her. What on earth does that mean? Because there's a whole lot there, that's very vague. That stipulation is very vague. That could mean anything from her not being a good cook, to snoring at night, to kicking puppies on the street. I mean, it could be almost anything you imagine, right? It seems that this standard could mean that you could get a divorce for any reason at all. Well, what are those vows that we take when we get married today? To have and to hold through sickness and in health, through rich and poor, through the easy times and through the hard times. This passage in Deuteronomy doesn't have a very high standard for marriage, really, does it? If you don't like your spouse anymore, you can just divorce them. See, Jesus is calling us to do a little better than that. Jesus is not creating a new law here. Jesus is saying you can do a little better than what the law allows you to do. Right? So if you don't like your spouse anymore, you can just divorce them. That sounds a lot like the disposable culture we have today. Now, let's be clear. I think that our current understanding from psychology and mental health awareness lets us know that we should have more exceptions than simply adultery. We know that. And it's okay for that to inform our spiritual decisions as well, and not just Scripture. Because remember, in Jesus' time, for example, abuse, a lot of the things that happened back then we would consider abuse, but wouldn't have been considered abuse in their culture. Right? We know a little better of the psychological harm, of the physical harm that can be caused. But Jesus was talking to his context 2,000 years ago. And he isn't here to answer the questions. We weren't at the Sermon on the Mount to say, well, what if? We weren't there for him to give a little bit more of an expository definition here. But I would imagine that in our current cultural context, and in this contract that we call marriage today, he would allow for other exceptions besides just adultery. For example, having an abusive spouse. Right? I do know one thing. Jesus does not force us. Jesus does not want to force us to stay in relationships that are abusive and unhealthy. This verse has hurt many people because it's been taken so literally and legalistically without reading the cultural context of the times and recognizing that the institution of marriage is quite different in 2024 in the United States than it was 2,000 years ago in Palestine. I can't imagine that Jesus would want people to stay an example for abusive relationships, physically abusive, emotionally abusive, sexually abusive, etc. But remember that in ancient times, a lot of things that we wouldn't consider abuse back then, or that they wouldn't have considered abuse back then, we would have now. We have that benefit of better mental health awareness today. But Jesus here in the Sermon on the Mount isn't really trying to give us a new law. He's just trying to push us past doing the bare minimum. In today's context, he'd be trying to push us to take our marriage vows more seriously, encourage us to push past some of the main reasons that people get divorced. Infidelity and abuse are rank high on that list, by the way. But they're not the only reasons. I have other things, compatibility and commitment from both sides, financial problems, marrying too young, which, by the way, that was my excuse. I was divorced. I've been divorced myself. A lot of you don't know that. I was very young. I was yay high. But marrying too young, which all those things, by the way, that I just stated, probably, as I said in there, if you had been prepared for your wedding vows a little bit better, perhaps this wouldn't have landed this way. Substance abuse, lack of intimacy, poor communication, and yes, even annoying habits makes the list. Person has annoying habits. They chew with their mouth open. And the divorce rates, by the way, have gotten a little better. Since they peaked in the United States, they peaked in 1979 and 1981. It was about the same. And in those last 40 years, it's been getting better. It's still almost half of marriages end in divorce, but that's better than it was in 1979. So we are actually doing better. So we need to take our commitment seriously, no matter what that commitment is. I'll brag on my daughter for a minute. We have a broken chicken. She's broken. She has one leg that works fine, but the foot doesn't work, and one leg that doesn't work, but the foot works. So she just kind of scoots around. Well, Alana's decided I'm going to take care of that chicken. It's a commitment to take care of the chicken because the chicken's very disabled and wouldn't have survived on its own. So she's done all kinds of things. She's created a hammock so that she can hang the chicken in the cage and make her learn to put her feet down underneath her, like rehabbing her, right? We've moved the chicken into the garage in a cage because it can't be with the other chickens. There's a commitment that was made. The commitment was, I'm going to take care of the chicken. So that's what's going to happen. Because it's important to honor our commitments. Let's not give up on things that we have promised to do. Let's not throw things away that are worth saving. Let our yes be yes and our no be no. Remember when we were talking a few weeks ago about murder? Because that's in the Sermon on the Mount too. We were talking about murder and talking about how feelings of anger are the roots of something like murder. And if we're mindful and aware of our feelings, if we stay there, we can deal with those problems when the roots of the problems are there. Jesus is doing the same thing here when he's talking about adultery. He understands that the lust of the eye and the heart lead to adultery. And that's why he talks about that being the sin, because it is the root of the sin. Because we actually think about breaking our vows and promises long before we actually do it, usually, don't we? And if we're self-aware enough, we can usually take measures to recommit ourselves. So whether it's a commitment to marriage or a contract of some kind or a career or a friendship, let's not take our commitments lightly. Let's not give in, except in cases where they're truly causing us harm. Let our yeses truly be yeses. Amen? All right. And now let us take